Chapter 46. I am in no way departing from the truth by stating that in that year of 1911, all of Persia was living in the age of the American, and that Schuster was indisputably the most popular official and one of the most powerful. The newspapers supported his actions all the more enthusiastically when he took the trouble to invite the editors over from time to time to brief them on his projects and solicit their advice on some prickly questions. Above all, and most importantly, his difficult mission was on the road to success. Before even reforming the fiscal system, he managed to balance the budget simply by limiting theft and waste. Previously, innumerable notables, princes, ministers, or high dignitaries would send their demands to the treasury in the form of a note scribbled on a greasy piece of paper, and the civil servants were constrained to satisfy them unless they wished to lose their job or their life. With Morgan, everything had changed overnight. I will give one example out of so many others. On 17th June, at the cabinet meeting, Schuster was presented with a pathetic request for the sum of 42 million tumans in order to pay the salaries of the troops in Tehran. Otherwise, a rebellion will break out, and it is the Treasurer General who will bear the entire responsibility, exclaimed Emir al-Azam, the Supreme Emir, the Minister of War. Schuster gave the following response. The minister himself took a similar sum 10 days ago. What has he done with it? I have used it to pay part of the soldiers' back pay. Their families are hungry and the officers are all in debt. The situation is intolerable. Is the minister certain that there is nothing left from that sum? Not the smallest coin. Schuster took out of his pocket a small visiting card which was covered with tiny writing and which he conspicuously consulted before stating, "The sum which the Treasury paid out 10 days ago has been deposited in its entirety in the personal account of the minister. Not one tuman has been spent. I have here the name of the banker and the figures." The Supreme Emir, a huge, fleshy man, stood up, bristling with rage. He placed his hand on his chest and cast a furious glance at his colleagues. "Is this an attempt to question my honor?" As no one reassured him on that point, he added, "I swear that if such a sum is indeed in my account, I am the last to know about it." There were some looks of incredulity around him. It was decided to bring in the banker, and Schuster asked the ministers to wait where they were. The moment it was indicated that the man had arrived, the Minister of War rushed to meet him. After an exchange of whispers, the Supreme Emir came back to his colleagues with an artless smile. "This damned banker had not understood my orders. He has not yet paid the troops. It was a misunderstanding." The incident was closed, albeit with some difficulty, but thereafter the state's high officials did not dare to pillage the treasury to their heart's content, a centuries-old custom. There were, of course, malcontents, but they had to keep silent since most of the people, even amongst the ranks of the government officials, had reason to be satisfied. For the first time in history, civil servants, soldiers, and Persian diplomats abroad received their salaries on time. Even in international financial circles, people were starting to believe in the Schuster miracle. As proof, the Seljuman brothers, bankers in London, decided to grant Persia a loan of 4 million pounds sterling without imposing any humiliating clauses of the type which were generally attached to this type of transaction. Neither a levy on customs receipts nor a mortgage of any sort. It was a normal loan to a normal, respectable, and potentially solvent client. That was an important step. In the eyes of those who wanted to subjugate Persia, it was a dangerous precedent. The British government intervened to block the loan. Meanwhile, the Tsar had recourse to more brutal methods. In July, it was learned that the former Shah had returned with 2 of his brothers and at the head of an army of mercenaries to try and seize power. Had he not been under house arrest in Odessa, with the Russian government's explicit promise never to allow him to return to Persia? When questioned, the St. Petersburg authorities replied that he had slipped out with a false passport and that his armaments had been transported in boxes labeled mineral water and that they themselves bore no responsibility for his rebellion. Thus, he had left his residence in Odessa and with his men crossed the few hundred miles separating the Ukraine and Persia, boarded a Russian ship with all his armaments, crossed the Caspian Sea, and disembarked on the Persian side, all of that without arousing the notice of the Tsar's government, his army, nor the Okhrana, his secret police. But what use was it to discuss the matter? Above all, the fragile Persian democracy had to be prevented from crumbling. Parliament asked Schuster for credit, and this time the American did not argue. On the contrary, he saw to it that an army was raised within a few days with the best available equipment and abundant ammunition. He himself suggested that it should be commanded by Ephraim Khan, a brilliant Armenian officer who within 3 months would succeed in crushing the ex-Shah and pushing him back across the border. In chancelleries throughout the world, it could hardly be believed. Had Persia become a modern state? Such rebellions generally dragged on for years. For most observers, both in Tehran and abroad, the response was summed up in a single magic word: Schuster. His role now went far beyond that of simply being Treasurer General. It was he who suggested to Parliament that they outlaw the former Shah and plaster wanted posters, as in the Wild West, on the walls of all the cities in the country, offering significant sums to anyone who helped to capture the imperial rebel and his brothers, all of which succeeded in discrediting the deposed monarch in the eyes of the population. The Tsar was still in a rage. It was now clear to him that his ambitions in Persia would not be satisfied while Schuster was there. He had to be made to leave. An incident had to be created, a large incident. A man was charged with this mission: Pakhtinov, a former consul in Tabriz and now consul general in Tehran. Mission is an unassuming word for what was, in that context, a plot which was carefully carried out, although without much finesse. Parliament had decided to confiscate the property of the ex-Shah's two brothers who were leading the rebellion at his side. Commissioned to carry out the sentence, as Treasurer General, Schuster wanted to do everything with the utmost legality. The principal property concerned, situated not far from the Atabak Palace, belonged to the imperial prince who went by the name Radiance of the Sultanate. The Americans sent a detachment of the police and civil servants there, armed with warrants. They found themselves face to face with Cossacks accompanied by Russian consular officers who forbade the police to enter the property, threatening to use force if they did not speedily retrace their steps. When told of the outcome, Schuster sent one of his aides over to the Russian legation. He was received by Pakhtinov, who, in an aggressive tone of voice, gave him the following explanation. The mother of Prince Radiance of the Sultanate had written to the Tsar and Tsarina to claim their protection, which was generously accorded. The American could not believe his ears. It was unjust that foreigners, he said, should enjoy the privilege of immunity in Persia, and that the assassins of a Persian minister could not be judged because they were the Tsar's subjects. But it was a time-honored rule and difficult to change. However, Persians overnight could place their property under the protection of a foreign monarch to deflect the laws of their own country. That was a novel and extraordinary process. Schuster did not want to resign himself to that. He gave an order to the police to go and take possession of the properties in question without the use of violence, but with determination. This time, Pakhtinov allowed it. He had created the incident. His mission was accomplished. The reaction was not slow in coming. A communiqué was published in St. Petersburg stating that what had happened amounted to an act of aggression against Russia and an insult to the Tsar and Tsarina. They were demanding an official apology from the Tehran government. In a panic, the Persian Prime Minister asked the British for advice. The Foreign Office replied that the Tsar was not playing games, that he had amassed troops in Baku, that he was preparing to invade Persia, and that it would be wise to accept the ultimatum. Thus, on 24th November 1911, the Persian Minister for Foreign Affairs, with a heavy heart, presented himself at the Russian delegation and shook hands fawningly with the Minister Plenipotentiary as he pronounced these words: "Your Excellency, my government has charged me with presenting to you, on its behalf, apologies for the insult which consular officials of your government have suffered." Still shaking the minister's hand, the Tsar's representative retorted, "Your apologies are accepted as a response to our first ultimatum. However, I must inform you that a second ultimatum is in preparation at St. Petersburg. I will advise you of its contents as soon as it reaches me." He kept his promise. 5 days later, on 29th November, at midday, the diplomat presented the Minister of Foreign Affairs with a text of the new ultimatum, adding orally that it had already received London's approval and that it had to be satisfied within 48 hours. Point 1. Dismiss Morgan Schuster. Point 2. Never again employ a foreign expert without obtaining beforehand the consent of the Russian and British legations. Chapter 47. In the Parliament building, the 76 deputies were waiting, some of them wearing turbans, others fezzes or hats. Some of the most militant sons of Adam were even dressed in European style. At 11 o'clock, the Prime Minister mounted the dais as if it were a scaffold, and with a stifled voice he read out the text of the ultimatum and then mentioned London's support for the Tsar, before announcing his government's decision not to resist but to accept the ultimatum and to dismiss the American. In a word, to return to the tutelage of the powers rather than to be crushed underfoot by them. In order to try and avoid the worst, he needed a clear mandate. He therefore asked for a show of confidence, reminding the deputies that the ultimatum would expire at midday, that they had a finite amount of time, and that discussions could not drag on. During the whole of his speech, he had kept glancing worriedly towards the visitors' gallery where sat enthroned Mr. Pakhtinoff, whom none had dared to forbid entering. When the Prime Minister went back to his seat, there were neither boos nor applause, but only a deafening, overwhelming, and oppressive silence. Then a venerable Sayyid arose, a descendant of the Prophet and modernist from the outset, who had always given enthusiastic support to Schuster's mission. His speech was short. "Perhaps it is the will of God that our freedom and sovereignty should be snatched away by force, but we will not abandon those principles of our own accord." There was silence again. Then another speech in the same vein and just as short. Mr. Pakhtinoff made a great show of looking at his watch. The Prime Minister saw him, and in his turn he pulled out his fob watch and held it up to read the time. It was 20 to 12. He became panicky and tapped the ground with his cane, demanding that they move on to a vote. 4 deputies hurriedly withdrew on various pretexts. The 72 remaining all said no. No to the Tsar's ultimatum, no to Schuster's departure, and no to the government's stance. By this fact, the Prime Minister was considered to have resigned, and he withdrew with his whole cabinet. Pakhtinoff also arose. The text he had to cable to St. Petersburg had already been drafted. The great door was slammed, and the echo reverberated a long time in the silence of the hall. The deputies were alone. They had won, but they did not feel like celebrating their victory. Power was in their hands. The fate of the country and its young constitution depended on them. What could they do with the power? What did they want to do with it? They had no idea. It was an unreal, pathetic, and chaotic session, and in some respects it was childish too. From time to time, someone came up with an idea, only to have it dismissed. And if we asked the United States to send us troops, why would they come? They are Russia's friends. Was it not President Roosevelt who brought about a reconciliation between the Tsar and the Mikado? But there is Schuster. Would they want to help him? Schuster is very popular in Persia, but at home he is hardly known. The American leaders will not be able to appreciate why he has got on the wrong side of London and St. Petersburg. We could suggest to them building a railway. Perhaps they would be enticed to come to our help. Perhaps, but not for 6 months, and the Tsar will be here within 2 weeks. And the Turks, the Germans, and why not the Japanese? Did they not crush the Russians in Manchuria? Suddenly, a young deputy from Kirman suggested with a hint of a smile that the throne of Persia should be offered to the Mikado, at which Faisal exploded. We must be aware once and for all that we cannot even make an appeal to the people of Isfahan. If we join battle, it will be in Tehran, with the people of Tehran and with arms which are currently in the capital, just as in Tabriz 3 years ago. And it is not 1,000 Cossacks that will be sent to fight us, but 50,000. We must know that we will fight without the slightest chance of winning. Coming from anyone else, this disheartening speech would have aroused a torrent of accusations. Coming from the hero of Tabriz, the most eminent son of Adam, the words were taken for what they were, an expression of cruel reality. After that, it was difficult to preach resistance, but that, however, was just what Faisal did. If we are ready to fight, it is solely in order to safeguard the future. Does Persia not still live in the memory of Imam Hussein? Yet this martyr did not more than lead a lost battle. He was defeated, crushed, and massacred, and it is he whom we honor. Persia needs blood in order to believe. There are 72 of us, the same number as Hussein's companions. If we die, this parliament will become a place of pilgrimage, and democracy will be anchored for centuries in the ground of the Orient. They all declared themselves ready to die, but they did not die. Not that they weakened or betrayed their cause. Exactly the opposite. They tried to organize the city's defenses, and volunteers, particularly sons of Adam, presented themselves in great numbers just as in Tabriz. However, it was to no avail. After invading the north of the country, the Tsar's troops were now advancing in the direction of the capital. Only the snow slowed down their progress a little. On 24th December, the fallen prime minister decided to take power again by force. Aided by Cossacks, Bakhtiari tribes, and an important section of the army and the police, he made himself master of the capital and had the dissolution of parliament proclaimed. Several deputies were arrested. Those who had been most active, with Faisal at the head of the list, were condemned to exile. The first act of the new regime was officially to accept the terms of the Tsar's ultimatum. A polite letter informed Morgan Schuster that an end had been put to his functions as Treasurer General. He had only been in Persia for 8 months, albeit 8 hectic and dizzying months, which all but changed the face of the Orient. On 11th January 1912, Schuster was seen off with honors. The young Shah placed his own car at his disposal, along with his French chauffeur, Monsieur Varlet, to drive him to the port of Enzeli. There were a lot of us, foreigners and Persians, who came to bid him farewell, some in front of his residence and others along the road. There were, of course, no cheers, just the discreet gestures of thousands of hands, the tears of men and women, and a crowd of strangers who were crying like abandoned lovers. Along the whole route, there was only one insignificant incident. As the convoy went past, a Cossack picked up a stone and made as if to throw it in the direction of the American. I do not believe that he even cared through his action. When the car had disappeared beyond the Caswin gate, I walked a little in the company of Charles Russell. Then I made my way alone, by foot, to Shireen's palace. "You seem rather crestfallen," she said, as she received me. "I have just come from bidding farewell to Schuster." "Ah, he is finally gone." I was not certain whether I had understood the tone of her exclamation. She explained herself. "Today I have been wondering whether it would not have been better if he had never set foot in this country." I looked at her with horror. "It is you who are saying that to me." "Yes, it is I, Shireen, who am saying that. I who applauded the American's arrival. I who approved every one of his actions. I who saw him as a redeemer. Now I regret the fact that he did not stay in far-off America." "But what did he do wrong?" "Nothing. And that is precisely the proof that he did not understand Persia." I really was not following her. If a minister is right and the king mistaken, a wife is right when her husband is wrong, or a soldier correct and his officer of course. Are they not punished doubly? In the eyes of the weak, it is wrong to be right. Compared to the Russians and the English, Persia is weak and should have known how to behave like a weak person. Until the end of time? Should Persia not recover one day and construct a modern state, educate its people, and enter into the concert of prosperous and respected nations? That is what Schuster was trying to do. For that I grant him the greatest admiration. However, I cannot help thinking that if he had succeeded a little less, we would not be in this lamentable situation today with our democracy destroyed and our territory invaded. The Tsar's ambitions being what they are, that would have happened sooner or later. It is always better for a misfortune to happen later. Do you know the story of Mullah Nasruddin's talking ass? Mullah Nasruddin was the semi-legendary hero of all the anecdotes and parables of Russia, Persia, Transoxania, and Asia Minor. Shireen told the story. It was said that a half-mad king had condemned Nasruddin to death for having stolen an ass. Just as he was about to be let off for execution, he exclaimed, "That beast is in reality my brother. A magician made him look like that. But if he were entrusted to me for a year, I would teach him to speak like us again." Intrigued, the monarch made the accused repeat his promise before decreeing, "Very well, but if within 1 year from today the ass does not speak, you will be executed." As he went out, Nasruddin was accosted by his wife. "How can you make a promise like that? You know very well that this ass will not speak." "Of course I know," replied Nasruddin, "but during the year the king might die, the ass might, or even I might." The princess went on. "If we had been able to gain some time, Russia might have got bogged down in the Balkans or in China. What's more, the Tsar is not eternal. He could die or be shaken by riots or revolts, as happened 6 years ago. We should have been patient and waited, used tricks, procrastinated, yielded, told lies, and given promises. That has always been the wisdom of the Orient. Schuster wanted to make us move to the rhythm of the Occident. He steered us straight to shipwreck." She seemed to be suffering from having said that, so I avoided contradicting her. She added, Persia makes me think of an unlucky sailing boat. The sailors constantly complain that there is not enough wind to move, and suddenly, as if to punish them, heaven sends them a tornado. We stayed silent for a long time, weighed down in thought. Then I put my arm around her affectionately. Shireen. Was it the way I uttered her name? She gave a start and then pushed me away as she gave me a suspicious look. You are leaving. Yes, but differently. How can one leave differently? I am leaving with you. Chapter 48. Cherbourg, 10th April 1912. The English Channel stretched as far as the eye could see, its surface flecked with silver. By my side was Shireen. We had the manuscript in our luggage. We were surrounded by an unlikely crowd, completely Oriental. So much has been said of the shining celebrities who set sail on the Titanic that we have almost forgotten those for whom these sea giants were built. The migrants, those millions of men, women, and children no country would agree to feed any more, and who dreamt of America. The steamboat had to make a lot of pickups. The English and Scandinavians from Southampton, the Irish from Queenstown, and at Cherbourg, those who came from further away, Greeks, Syrians, Armenians from Anatolia, Jews from Salonika or Bessarabia, Croats, Serbs, and Persians. It was these Orientals that I was able to watch at the harbor station, clustered around their pathetic luggage, in a hurry to be somewhere else, and in a state of anguish from time to time, suddenly looking for a lost form, a child who was too agile, or an unmanageable bundle which had rolled under a bench. On everyone's face there was written adventure, bitterness, or defiance. They all felt that it was a privilege, the moment they arrived in the West, to be taking part in the maiden voyage of the most powerful, the most modern, and most dependable steamboat ever dreamed up by man. My own feelings were hardly different. Having been married 3 weeks earlier in Paris, I put back my departure with the sole aim of offering my companion a wedding trip worthy of the Oriental splendor in which she had lived. It was not a vain whim. For a long time, Shireen had seemed reticent about the idea of living in the United States, and had it not been for the fact that she was so disheartened by Persia's failed reawakening, she would never have agreed to follow me. My ambition was to build up around her a world which was yet more magical than the one she had had to leave. The Titanic served my purposes marvelously. It seemed to have been conceived by men who were eager to enjoy in this floating palace the most sumptuous pleasures of terra firma, as well as some of the joys of the Orient. A Turkish bath just as indolent as those of Constantinople or Cairo, verandas dotted with palm trees, and in the gymnasium, between the bar and the pommel horse, there was an electric camel, which, when you pressed the magic button, instilled the rider the feeling of a jumpy ride in the desert. However, as we explored the Titanic, we were not just trying to search out the exotic. We also managed to give ourselves over to wholly European pleasures, such as eating oysters, followed by a sauté de poulet à la lyonnaise, the specialty of Monsieur Proctor, the chef, washed down by a Coast d'Estournel 1887, as we listened to the orchestra dressed in blue tuxedos playing the tales of Hoffmann, the Geisha, or the Grand Mogul by Lutter. Those moments were even more precious to Shireen and me since we had had to keep our pretenses throughout our long romance in Persia. ample and promising as my princess's apartments had been in Tabriz, Zarganda, or Tehran. I suffered constantly from the feeling that our love was restricted within their walls, with its only witness engraved mirrors and servants with fleeting glances. Now we could take simple pleasure in being seen together, a man and a woman, arm in arm, taken in by the same strange looks. We avoided going back to our cabin until late at night, even though I had chosen one of the most spacious on board. Our final delight was the evening promenade. When we finished dinner, we could go on and find an officer, always the same one, who would lead us to a safe from which we would take out the manuscript and carry it carefully on a tour across bridges and down corridors. Seated in rattan armchairs in the Persian cafe, we would read some quatrains at random, then taking the lift, we would go up to the walkway where, without having to worry too much as to whether we could be seen, we would exchange a passionate kiss in the open air. Late in the night, that we would take the manuscript to our room where it spent the night before being placed back in the safe. In the morning, with the help of the same officer, it was a ritual which enchanted Shireen, so much so that I made it a duty for myself to retain every detail in order to reproduce it exactly the next day. That is how, on the fourth evening, I had opened the manuscript at the page where Khayyam in his day had written, "You ask what is this life so frail, so vain? 'Tis long to tell, yet will I make it plain. 'Tis but a breath blown from the vasty deeps, and then blown back to those same deeps again." The reference to the ocean amused me. I wanted to read it again, more slowly, but Shireen interrupted me. "Please don't." She seemed to be suffocating. I looked at her worriedly. "I know that Rubai by heart," she said in a faint voice, and I suddenly had the impression that I was hearing it for the first time. It is as if... She would not explain, however, and got her breath back before stating in a light and serene tone of voice, "I wish that we had already arrived." I shrugged my shoulders. If there is a ship in the world on which one can travel without fear, it is this one. As Captain Smith said, God himself could not sink this ship. If I had thought to reassure her with those words and my happy tone, it was in fact the opposite which I effected. She clutched my arm, murmuring, "Never say that again. Never." "Why are you getting so worked up? You know very well that it was only a joke." "Where I come from, even an atheist would not dare use such a phrase." She was trembling. I could not understand why she was reacting so violently. I suggested that we go back to the cabin and had to support her so that she would not stumble on the way. The next day she seemed to be herself again. In order to occupy her mind, I took her off to discover the wonders of the ship. I even mounted the jerky electric camel at the risk of putting up with the laughs of Henry Sleeper Harper, the editor of the eponymous weekly, who stayed for a moment in our company, offered us tea, and told us about his trips in the Orient, before introducing us most ceremoniously his Pekingese dog, which he thought acceptable to call Sun Yat-sen, in ambiguous homage to the emancipator of China. However, nothing managed to cheer Shireen up. That evening, at dinner, she was taciturn. She seemed to have become weak. I thought it best not to go on our ritual promenade and left the manuscript in the safe. We went back to our cabin to go to bed. She immediately fell into a disturbed sleep. I, on the other hand, was worried about her, and unused as I was to sleeping so early, I spent a good part of the night watching her. Why should I lie? When the ship hit the iceberg, I was not aware of anything. It was after the collision, when I was told at exactly what moment it had taken place, that I thought I could remember having heard a noise like a sheet being torn in a nearby cabin shortly before midnight. Nothing else. I do not remember feeling any impact and managed to doze off, only to wake up with a start when someone rapped on the door, shouting a phrase which I could not make out. I looked at my watch. It was 10 to 1. I put on my dressing gown and opened the door. The corridor was empty, but from afar I could hear loud conversation, something unusual for so late at night. Without actually being worried, I decided to go and see what was happening, of course making no move to wake Shireen. On the stairway, I came across a steward who spoke lightly of a few little problems which had just cropped up. He said that the captain wanted all the first class passengers to assemble on the sun bridge at the top of the ship. Must I wake my wife? She has been a little unwell during the day. The captain said everyone, the steward retorted with the look of a skeptic. Back in the cabin, I woke Shireen with the necessary tenderness, stroking her forehead and then her eyebrows, pronouncing her name with my lips fast to her ear. When she gave out a little groan, I whispered, "You must get up. We have to go up on the bridge." "Not tonight. I am too cold." "It is not for a promenade. They are the captain's orders." The last two words had a magical effect. She jumped out of bed, shouting, "Hodaya! My God!" She got dressed quickly and in a state of disorder. I had to keep her calm, tell her to slow down, that we were not in such a hurry. However, when we arrived on the bridge, there was an atmosphere of turmoil and passengers were being directed toward the lifeboats. The steward I had met earlier was there. I went over to him. He had lost none of his cheeriness. "Women and children first," he said in a tone that poked fun at the phrase. I took Shireen by the hand to try and lead her over to the boats, but she refused to move. "The manuscript," she pleaded. "We would run the risk of losing it in all the crush. It is better off in the safe." "I will not leave without it." "There is no question of leaving," the steward interjected. "We are getting the passengers off the ship for an hour or two. If you want my advice, even that is not necessary, but the captain is the master of the ship." I would not say that she was convinced by that, but she simply let herself be pulled along by the hand without putting up any resistance, as far as the forecastle, where an officer called me. "Sir, over here. We need you." I went up to him. "This lifeboat needs a man. Can you row?" "I have rowed for years in Chesapeake Bay." Satisfied by that, he invited me to get into the boat and help Shireen to clamber in. There were about 30 people in it, with as many places still empty, but the orders were only to load the women and some experienced rowers. We were winced down to the ocean somewhat abruptly to my taste, but I managed to keep the boat steady and began to row. But where to, or toward what point in this black void, I did not have the least idea, and neither did the men handling the evacuation. I decided just to get away from the ship and to wait at a distance of a half a mile for some signal to call me back. During the first minutes, everyone's concern was how we could all protect ourselves against the cold. There was an icy breeze blowing which prevented us hearing the tune which the ship's orchestra was still playing. However, when we stopped at what seemed to me an adequate distance, the truth suddenly dawned on us. The Titanic was leaning distinctly forwards and her lights were gradually fading. We were all dumbfounded. Suddenly, there was a call from a man who was swimming. I maneuvered the lifeboat towards him. Shireen and another passenger helped him to drag him on board. Soon, other survivors were making signs to us and we went to haul them out. While we were occupied with this task, Shireen gave out a cry. The Titanic was now in a vertical position and its lights had dimmed. She stayed like that for 5 endless minutes and then solemnly plunged towards her destiny. We were flat out, exhausted, and surrounded by forlorn faces when the sun surprised us on 15th April. We were on board the Carpathia, which, on receiving a distress call, had rushed over to pick up the survivors from the wreck. Shireen was at my side, silent. Since we had seen the Titanic go down, she had not spoken a word, and her eyes were avoiding me. I wanted to shake her, to remind her that we had been saved miraculously, that most of the passengers had perished, and that there were around us on the bridge women who had just lost their husbands and children, who were now orphans. However, I stopped myself preaching to her. I knew that the manuscript was for her as it was for me, more than a jewel, more than a precious antique, that it was, to some extent, our reason for being together. Its disappearance, come after so many misfortunes, had to have a serious effect on Shireen. I felt it would be wiser to let time heal. As we drew close to the port of New York, late on the evening of 18th April, a noisy reception was awaiting us. Reporters had come to meet us on rented boats, and with the aid of the megaphones, they shouted questions over to us, and some of the passengers cupped their hands to their mouths and tried to shout back answers. When the Carpathia had berthed, other journalists hurried over to the survivors, all trying to guess which might be the truest or most sensational account. It was a very young writer from the Evening Sun who chose me. He was particularly interested in Captain Smith's behavior as well as that of crew members at the time of the catastrophe. Had they succumbed to panic? In their exchanges with the passengers, had they covered up the truth? Was it true that the first-class passengers had been saved first? Each of his questions had made me think back and rack my memory. We spoke for a long time, first as we were disembarking, then standing up on the quay. Shireen had stayed for a moment at my side, still not saying a word. Then she slipped away. I had no reason to worry. She could not really have gone far. Surely she was somewhere nearby, hidden behind this photographer who was focusing a blinding flash at me. As he left me, the journalist complimented me on the quality of my account and took my address in order to get in touch with me later. Then I looked all around and called out louder and louder. Shireen was no longer there. I decided not to move from the spot where she had left me so that she would be able to find me again. I waited for an hour, for 2 hours. The quay gradually emptied. Where should I look? First of all, I went to the office of White Star, the company to which the Titanic belonged. Then I checked all the hotels where the survivors had been lodged for the night. However, yet again I found no sign of my wife. I returned to the quays. They were deserted. Then I decided to set off for the only place whose address she knew, and where once she had calmed down, she would know how to find me. My house in Annapolis. I waited for some sign of Shireen for a long time, but she never came. She did not write to me. No one mentioned her name anymore in front of me. Today, I wonder, did she exist? Was she anything other than the fruit of my oriental obsessions? At night, in the solitude of my overlarge bedroom, when doubt rises up in me, when my memory clouds over and I feel my reason waver, I get up and turn on all the lights. I rush and take out the letters of yesteryear, which I pretend to open as if I had just received them. I breathe in their perfume and reread some pages. The very coldness of the letters tone comforts me and gives me the illusion that I am experiencing anew the birth of love. Then, alone and soothed, I put them in order and dive back into the dark, ready to give myself over without fright to the dazzling sights of the past. A phrase uttered in a Constantinople sitting room, 2 sleepless nights in Tabriz, a brazier in the winter in Sarganda, and this scene from our last trip. We had gone up on the walkway into a dark and deserted corner where we had exchanged a long kiss. In order to take her face in my hands, I had placed the manuscript flat on a bollard. When she noticed it, Shireen burst out laughing. She stepped away from me, and with a theatrical gesture she shouted to the sky, "The Rubaiyat on the Titanic! The flower of the Orient born by a jewel of the Occident! Khayyam, if you could only see what a beautiful moment has been granted to us."